Dallas in Baltimore and WNST.net. We are in Indianapolis, Indiana. We're here at the Convention Function Hall. Boy, have they changed the NFL Combine, Luke Jones. This is quite the S show we got going on here. We're all kind of crowded in.
Despite being in a gigantic convention center.
Hall of Famers we're going to have on the program here the next 3 days.
Hall of Famers?
Yes. Over under. This is not the Super Bowl. Let's point that out.
2.5?
2.5. Oh, really? You go? Wow, you're putting pressure on me now. John Ogden's not in town.
Now you need to find two.
Trouble. Woodson's not a coach anymore. We're in trouble.
Unless Ozzie Newsome comes and sits down with us after he talks on Friday.
I don't think that's going to happen. We will have Ozzie Newsome on the air this week because he is speaking on Friday. Of course, all of our coverage brought to you by our friends at Howard Bank. Also want to give some love to Royal Farms. Now, my coffee mug is empty right now, but it will be full at some point. I brought, even if I can't have Royal Farms coffee on the road, at least I can have the mug.
You want to be reminded of Royal Farms coffee.
Download the app, use it, and save some dough and get yourself some free fried chicken. I will be eating free fried chicken and Western fries during the season this year because I gas up at Royal Farms all the time. We're gassed up for conversation about the Combine. And, I'll just say this much. Where we are right now, and this is our sort of scene setter here for Indianapolis, way different gig. We're just not going to have kids walking through here. This is a whole – they've revamped this thing. We won't be in Indianapolis next year.
Well, the thing about it is in previous years, and this is my third Combine, I think it is, so I haven't been here many years
probably
compared to you.
14 for me, 13, 14.
But and last year we didn't make the trip. 2 years ago, they still had everything at the stadium. It was in the concourse. So if we were set up in a miniature version of Radio Row. There's never as many broadcasting as you have at the Super Bowl in a given year, but it used to be in the concourse of Lucas Oil Stadium where everyone would walk by, coaches, players, any media that we want to try to have on the show. And now we're kind of tucked into the convention center, which is next to
We're just going to make it a cozy chat for you and I.
We'll get some,
and other team employees here.
Right.
Doing radio shows.
Yeah, all the teams are broadcasting. So it's just a little bit of a different format. It is what it is. These things get bigger and bigger. As you can see in the background of our video right now, they have a Combine fan experience. And that's not brand new, but it's clear that they are moving more in that direction.
People can watch bench press 50 feet away from us.
You can get a photo op with a bench press. So you can
or the Cleveland Browns logo.
I mean, it's amazing to me what this thing has transformed into over the years. I can think back to being a college kid who really liked the draft, and I'm talking early part of the 2000s.
You bought your little book, your little R-Lads book.
At that point,
subscribed to Mel Kiper.
There was a little bit on the internet, just enough.
Joe Bucksbaum.
I can vividly recall being a sophomore at Syracuse. That was the Byron Leftwich, Terrell Suggs year, 2003, and I could have probably told you about the top 100 prospects. I'm not saying I was Mel Kiper.
I was sitting at Begonia Ale House that day awaiting the arrival of Kyle Bowler.
But I could have told you probably about the top 100 guys in that draft, a little something about
Sure. At least knew their school position.
It's just, this thing has just blown up from and look, it's important to the teams. It's always been important to the teams. But from a coverage standpoint, the body wasn't even cold for the 2017 season when the Ravens collapsed against Cincinnati, and 2 days later, fans are asking you questions about the draft. I mean, it's just it's
the
amazing.
Next thing you move on to. I mean, we've had the team for 22 years, right? So, part of that is this. Baldinger would always call it the fruit fly cycle of 7 days for a football player from from Sunday to Sunday.
Right.
For the fans, Billick would always say time for pay, time for play,
sure.
Right? The minute that you get eliminated, and look, back in the early days, me being a draft nerd with Phil Savage and all that stuff back in the 90s and having nerd draft parties that lots of people came to. And conversation, really, the conversation starter about why John Ogden was better choice than Leland McElroy, who was the other guy at the time. But I think there's part of it with the draft where they become so secretive now, and with the internet, that there used to be good intel, good information.
Sure.
Now that there's more conversation around it, there's less of it that is about who's taking whom other than opinions on the actual players, which isn't such a bad thing because these mock drafts and the interest level of this is, all right, we can't win. Back in the early days of the Ravens, in November we were looking at the draft because and in Cleveland they look at the draft in September every year.
They look at the draft in May.
Well, I mean,
for the following year.
Because if you are a fan and you're engaged with those 16 weeks, part of the league's experience that I think that they've taken advantage of maybe too much is, dude, there's only how much football? Like, there's an hour of real football. Of that, what's it, 21 minutes or 18 minutes of actual movement that goes on the field? Other than the actual games themselves, it's not like baseball where we played 162 days. So the minute you get eliminated, the next thing is, well, how does my team get better? Well, this is part of that. Then the draft is part of that. But it is a lot over 100 days, literally.
It really is. And to the point that you just made, this is the time of year where there's a lot of information
Mike
that they gather
Mamula's
here.
over there somewhere.
The medical information, you always hear about that being one of the paramount benefits. That's why the Combine started, for the medical aspect of it. But I think the teams that are the absolute best at this, they're the ones that are using this as a snapshot, not as something that's going to turn their draft board upside down. You ultimately want to go back to the tape. You want to go back. The
Ravens always talk about that. They always talk about how they saw these kids play football.
Sure. Hopefully confirms that through the interview process, through the measurables. I mean, it's not as though 40-yard dash times are irrelevant, but if you have a certain opinion of a player and he runs a little bit slower than you expected, I don't think that should mean that he goes tumbling down your draft board.
A lot of this is for show is the important part here.
Sure.
The show of how many times you're going to bench press this or how fast you're going to run down a track. I think that's a smaller part of the picture.
And I think on the flip side, where you have the players that you like and maybe they don't test as well as you'd like, that's something that you need to be aware of, but be leery of not overreacting. On the flip side, you have so many players who on tape weren't all that impressive. They blow up, right? I mean, they have a ridiculous 40-yard dash time. They bench press 225 pounds so many times that you're just wowed by that. You have to watch out for. And
Four or 5 years to get themselves into a position to go get a payday. But in the case of McPhee, they knew that he was going to be a guy they wouldn't sign to say, no matter how well he played, because they felt that way about him. And now I don't know if his career is over. I mean, hell, they might bring him back. But if he could play, the Bears would like him.
Right. And on the flip side, you have a guy like Rob Gronkowski who was taken off plenty of teams' board for medical reasons. And you look at, he's one of the greatest tight ends in the history of the game right now if he never plays another snap. So you have both sides of that. It's as much as these teams try to quantify information and make it objective and say it's science, there's still so much unknown. That's why you just gather as much information as you can. I think you ultimately have to keep coming back to production on the field, how they played on tape. This is certainly something that can enhance or it can cause you to go back and review. But it's amazing what this thing has become, even compared to 10 or 15 years ago. I mean, we have in the background here, there is a little bench press stadium area where there are bleachers set up where players are going to be bench pressing and fans can come watch that. Compare that to when this thing really started, when it was established in Indy in the mid-'80s or so. It's incredible to think what it's become. And let's remind everyone, as much as right now the Combine is going to be a big topic of conversation in the sports world and NFL Network will be broadcasting the entire weekend, everything going on, we still have 8 weeks to go until the draft. After the Combine. I think it's 8. Roughly 2 months, a little less than 2 months. So it really reiterates how long this process is. And I'll go back to something Steve Bisciotti said at his press conference a month ago, where the Ravens, he's acknowledged they probably have had some paralysis by analysis with too many opinions on the top 60 to 65 players on their draft board. It is such a long process. And I'm not saying you shouldn't take advantage of all that time.
Well, you fall in love with the kid, and you probably fall further in love with him as you get closer to the draft.
Right.
And the way that sort of Ozzie did famously with Dwayne Starks and some other players. I think C.J. Mosley's one of those guys.
Right.
Clearly they liked Marlon Humphrey last year more than we maybe thought that they did.
Sure.
But
there's no question about
15 years ago in the draft process, I always sort of knew what they were thinking. Eric DeCosta and Joe Ortiz, they don't want to tell me what they're thinking right now because I'm dangerous to them. Well, everyone's dangerous to them. Right?
And let's be totally honest, and Bisciotti alluded to this. They should, at this point now, considering where their drafts have been the last 4 or 5 years, where
I don't mind them being paranoid about the draft.
Well,
I really don't.
But they haven't been horrible by any stretch, but they've clearly had some misses in the first round. They've had some misses in the second and third round. So they are, I'm sure, revamping how they do some things, or they should be anyway. Not saying you change it completely, turn it upside down, but if you're someone that cares about your best practices are what? Always evolving, always being tinkered with. And I think the Ravens at this point, given where they are as an organization right now, not that it's been terrible, but it hasn't been where it was 5-6 years ago, they're probably revamping some things, and they certainly don't want anyone to know what exactly they're doing on that front. So, well, I
know they're getting far more into analytics. I mean, I know that from the baseball side of the guys in the organization who like baseball, and that includes Eric DeCosta and Ozzie Newsome and Joe Ortiz. They like baseball. They're all baseball fans. That they've seen what baseball and analytics have done, and they've brought in their own mad scientist in the side door.
Sure, and that's certainly it's certainly something that's not
their
changing.
Own Sashi Brown.
It's not going away, but. The thing that I'll remind everyone, and even people inside football would know this, the analytics aren't as sophisticated as what baseball is in 2018 because...
Well, we talked to Steve Palazzolos, who's a baseball guy as well, right?
Analytics have been in the game in baseball for 3 decades now. Now, it's a long time.
Back to Earl Weaver's note cards.
And what they talked about in 1985 as being important isn't necessarily what they're talking about now. So it's an evolving process. It's a moving target. I know from talking to people who've worked in the organization, there's been a lot of talk over the last 5-6 years as far as risk aversion with injuries. They'd go back and not just track the number of games that a player missed, but how many snaps did he miss within a game. Those are things that they've tracked, and a lot of this is just data collecting. We think of analytics as some weird formula like WAR in baseball or weighted runs created, different things like that. And yes, that's certainly a big part of it.
Huh?
But so much of it is just tracking information, quantifying what you used to just use. You used to use generalities or make generalizations about something. It's like, okay, you're telling me that this is the kind of player who takes plays off. Let's track that. Let's go through and watch every single play that the defensive end for Mississippi State.
Well, that was a word on Haloti Ngata back in the day. That he took plays off. That was
right. So it's great to say that, but don't you want to have some data next to that to prove it? I mean, it's great to just make those statements, but so that's what a lot of when people talk about analytics and statistical analysis, that's really what it is. It isn't necessarily something that's that terribly complicated. It's just tracking these things. So, I mean, it's changing. I think where the Ravens definitely were a team that was cutting edge as far as figuring out this draft process. 20 years ago, maybe not using analytics per se, but they clearly were ahead of the game compared to a lot of teams
Phil
out
Savage
there.
always credits Ted Marchibroda for that, literally.
Yeah.
He said that Ted had a certain kind of temperament he wanted with a football player, and Ray Lewis and those players, Jamie Sharper, Peter Boulware, all fit that suit.
But it's fair to question now as we're in 2018 and the Ravens have now been in Baltimore for over 2 decades. Have other teams caught up to them from a standpoint of all the information that is out there now?
Part of that is you have Joe Douglas and these guys that leave the organization and go run other places.
But I'm just talking in general. When you look at how much information is out there now, you have scouting services that teams can subscribe to. Many teams like the Ravens haven't over the years. But you just wonder if maybe everyone else has kind of caught up in the same way that the Oakland Athletics don't have that advantage anymore of Moneyball because every team is using those principles. It's just a matter of how rigid they have to follow that, how rigid they have to be.
One day our competitors will One day, our competitors will actually get on the internet. One day they will.
But it's just it is really fascinating to see how this has all evolved. And if you're a team like the Ravens, where you're picking in the middle of the first round, you're hoping you can find some edges because you're hoping that you can find good value and in the second round, third round, find that wide receiver that's going to be the next Juju
There's also an evaluative part
Smith-Schuster.
that if I'm sitting with Eric and I'm talking to Eric about this, I would say, what do you learn when Arthur Brown can't get on the field, Matt Elam can't get on the field?
Sure.
Gray is having trouble getting on the field. It's one thing to say.
Go back and look at those trends in college.
But it's one thing to say that guy got hurt, right? Like
Sure.
you could have said that about Perryman the first year, right? You could say, well, he got hurt, and
even this past year, he missed most of training camp. That matters.
Absolutely.
We said it mattered for Joe Flacco. It was a 10th-year veteran, so it has to matter for a third-year receiver. So there are a lot of variables at work, and I think
it is dry in Indianapolis. Let me tell you that.
For any team that's going to be successful, whether you're talking draft, free agency, building your offense, building your defense, special teams, it's all about understanding your variables and controlling them, as many of them as you can.
But it's also your
really
system, though. Sure. Arthur Brown might have been okay elsewhere. If you look at John Simon,
maybe. Although Arthur Brown, and this is one thing that I've said to people because some people have criticized and said, "What? Well, the Ravens didn't use him properly. He didn't develop properly." Arthur Brown also went on to get cut by 3 or 4 other teams, and at this point, as far as I'm aware, is out of the league completely. So.
Well, there's part of this where you do all this and you run and you weight lift here, and then you get drafted, right? And then and you've seen all of this. You've seen highly thought of guys on draft day go by the wayside because they show up. They're away from their mommy. They're away from college. They're with new people. They're in a new system. They got to get themselves out of bed.
Right.
They've been coddled at college. And I think part of this is what makes the Brandon Williams or the Ryan Jensens, these guys that were completely overlooked here, get into the league.
Or at least undervalued.
Guys that were completely overlooked here get into the league.
Or at least undervalued, sure, being from a small school.
But from that day forward, that first summer when you step on campus, are you learning more and getting better every minute? So Harbaugh always talks about that. We got to learn more. We got to get better. We got to get better. We got to get better. And it seems to me a guy like Arthur Brown, who's an incredibly intelligent guy, right? And I think that they love that part of him. He didn't get better, and then we went into other systems. He was just as confused 3, 4, 5 years in and couldn't do what they wanted to do in 4 other organizations.
Well,
right?
And you just said it. And look, I don't know what Arthur Brown's IQ is or I don't remember what his grades were in school.
I'm sure he was a high Wonderlic guy.
But there's a difference between intelligence and being able to think at the NFL level about the game necessarily. I mean,
you don't have time to be analytical when you're on the field.
Well, at some point you have to make that transition from, well, it's not instinct. You have to learn, but you learn it to the point where it becomes like instinct. It's learned behavior, but at some point the thinking needs to kind of be cast to the side and it just needs to be reaction, right? I mean, but getting back to this whole complicated process, I mean, and I'm not making excuses for anyone. The Ravens have had some significant misses the last 4 or 5 years. There's no question about that. But just in general, everyone kind of asks, well, okay, how did so-and-so, how did Jamarcus Russell be the number 1 overall pick and flame out as badly as he did? And I'm just using him as one example. These are job interviews. In any career field, you can hire a person.
I've made some hiring mistakes.
You can hire a person in any career field, any walk of life, and you might, on paper, the resume looks great. The interview, they hit it out of the park. And it doesn't even mean they're a bad person, but sometimes they just get into that And you know what? It doesn't fit. It doesn't work for whatever reason.
Well, people also change, which is my
and that's
point
the other
here,
part too. Sure.
Are you getting better from the minute you get into the league, or are you not?
Sure.
If you are, you get to be Brandon Williams or Pernell McPhee.
And I can
if you're not, you're, I don't know, name any Bronson Kafusi that's in the middle of it right now, trying to figure it out.
And what's funny is you do have guys who are late bloomers, guys who first 2-3 years in the league, for whatever reason, whether coaches didn't believe in them, whether they were slow, kind of a late bloomer.
We haven't seen much of that in Baltimore, have we, though?
Paul Kruger was considered a late bloomer.
Okay.
At the same time, there was remember what was one of the big things about him his first couple of years? He didn't play special teams, so he wasn't a starting player because he was behind Terrell Suggs and Jarrett Johnson, but he didn't play special teams. That was kind of a criticism that, hey, you need to get this guy on the field, and we might be talking about that with Tim Williams over the next year or two. But I think it's interesting how you do have guys who are late bloomers. And I've also talked to coaches over the years who it could be a second, third, fourth round pick, someone who should be a guy that should be a real player for you at some point. And they'd say, I could have told you the first 2 weeks of OTAs that this guy can't play, and then that guy ends up being gone in 2 years after just being a backup. And
how do you come to that, using a second or third round pick that the guy can't play 2 weeks in when all of that's the hard part for me, is all of this that goes into this, all the eyeballs that go into this.
I think
it doesn't necessarily make the players better, by the way. Just because you're in the top 100 and someone selected you, there's always going to be those flameouts.
There's going to be, and some of it is up to the player. Some of it, a lot of this is what's a good fit. Mean, clearly, if you're, the Ravens run a 3-4, even though it's very multiple, so it's not really a traditional 3-4. But let's say you're a team that's a very rigid 4-3 kind of a team, and then you take a 3-4 defensive end. Okay, you might be able to slide him inside, but right off the bat, it's a round peg, square peg, round hole kind of thing. And you have some of that.
Jernigan went through that a little bit. Right?
And on the flip side, Jernigan's a good example of someone who was productive, but certainly wasn't in the best.
It wasn't
fit.
ideal.
He was more, and you saw what happened in Philadelphia. Even though he didn't have huge statistics, they clearly liked him enough that they gave him a long-term deal and some lucrative guaranteed money. But I think on the flip side, because of that, you always talk about versatility. And having talked to someone recently about someone like Kamale Correa, for example, the Ravens thought that he was a guy that they could plug in at outside linebacker or inside linebacker. Right off the bat, that sounds very valuable, right?
Sure.
You want to have guys like that. At the same time, Albert McClellan's a guy like that. The problem is Albert McClellan is a very serviceable backup, great special teams player, but do you want to invest a second-round pick and that's all you're going to get? Not really. Now, Correa might prove everyone wrong, but 2 years into
he hasn't been able to play
thing,
either one of them yet.
He can, but only at a backup quality level. So you get to the point where you're looking at these different players. You're looking for versatility. Versatility is great. You know who else is very versatile? Ryan Flaherty for the Orioles.
Phillies.
Well, now for the Phillies, but I'm saying over the last 5 to 6 years, versatility was his biggest strength, but he wasn't a starting caliber player at any of those positions. So I'm not saying you don't need that, but something like that is where you're talking about a backup, 5th, 6th round, that's where it looks good. 2nd round, not so much. So Correa is just one of the most recent examples, but it's where you get into a guy plays a certain way in college, is used a certain way in college. Keep in mind, most college systems are not nearly as sophisticated. We're seeing that all the time now with offensive line play being what it is in that transition.
Well, it's a different game.
Exactly.
It literally is a different game.
So
the hash marks and everything.
But these are the challenges, to get back to your point as far as how does a 2nd or 3rd round pick come in and be a non-factor. The things we're talking about are things where that can happen. And on top of that, don't really get to know guys as well as you think. All of these players, think about it. These guys that have played at such a high level at the college level, I'm not saying they haven't had adversity, but most of them haven't had a ton of adversity, at least in terms of on the field. Personal lives, family, their history, whatever, who knows? Plenty of guys like that, but Kamale Correa was always the best player on the field wherever he played, right? Bronson Kafusi was probably the best player on the field wherever he played, right? They get to the NFL level, and they're facing everyone else who has been in that position typically. So
kind of like when we play travel.
It isn't right, exactly right. So it isn't so much that they have some adjustments and some growing pains. That's true, but you don't necessarily know how that individual is going to respond to that setting for the first time. I'm not picking on those two. I'm just using two examples that give us some context here. You don't know. Kamalei Correa at Boise State was the best player on the field. Kafusi, one of the best players on the field at BYU. Coming to the NFL level, they're not going to be the best player on the field, and that's something that you try to do your homework as much as you can as far as a player's work ethic and attitude and all that, but you still don't know exactly how they're going to respond to being in that setting. Some guys respond great. Some guys thrive in being in that competitive arena where they're no longer the best guy and they know they have to work, and other guys might do everything they can and work hard, but just there's something in their DNA or something in their intestinal fortitude, whatever it might be, that holds them back. So it's very complicated. I'm not making excuses for any team. This is just in general. That's why you end up having some of these misses. And some of these guys are really 4th or 5th round talents based on their tape. They come to the combine and they're absolute stars, and then they become a 2nd rounder.
Because of the bench press.
Yeah, because of the bench press or 40-yard time or their hand size or all of that.
He's Luke Jones. You can find him out on the internet at Baltimore Luke as well as at WNST.net. You can find both of us in the buyatoyota.com audio vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device by downloading the TuneIn radio app. Our morning newspaper ships directly and digitally to your email inbox each and every morning. That is brought to you by Planet Fitness and PlanetFitness.com. Don't forget the entries for Laurel, now a part of our morning newspaper as well as the front page of WNST.net. Last but never least, any breaking news from Sarasota to here in Indianapolis, you'll get it first on the WNST Tech Service. That's all brought to you by Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. Dennis Colazzos. We'll be here on Thursday from 3 until 5, driving you home, getting you ready for the weekend. We're getting you ready for all things Combine. I don't know how many guests we're going to have here, but we're going to sit here. We're going to talk some football. We're going to have some friends drop by once we get everything settled and underway. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports. Have here, but we're going to sit here. We're going to talk some football. We're going to have some friends drop by once we get everything settled and underway. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.